Hello, and I hope everyone is having a good election day in the US. I know not everybody votes, and there's usually a lot fewer people that are voting on the midterm elections. But I would think on this election, a lot more people would be voting. Maybe not as many as the Democrats hope because of the Roe v. Wade decision, but that's part of it. Historically, the government and power of the party loses some to many in Congress because it's essentially a referendum on how they're doing. And as James Carville said, a famous bold advisor from Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. And as we know, the economy is just in a free fall shitstorm. Now, of course, they'll tell you that it's the highest it's been in 40 years and it's X amount of percent inflation. But of course, what they don't tell you is based on the bucket of products in that mix. They're quite different than reality because it's a specialized set to take advantage of a lot of products that actually drop in price, such as technology items. And it's also different than the product mix they had in the 1990s and the 1980s. So to put this into perspective, in 1990s perspective, in 2021, before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which is blamed for everything for the Putin price hikes, which is about as much bullshit as Russiagate. It is around 12.5%. Based on the 1980s mix, it was around 15.5%, but both of those actually were created to hide the true inflation, which often is 2 or 3 times what the actual inflation rate is. That's right. So our inflation 2021 could be as high as 33%. Is that what you're saying, Scott? That's absolutely what I'm saying. I think it might have even been 40% or more. But I think what we need to do, I'm going to raise a few questions, is I think the narrative and the assumptions that everyone has of what inflation is only part of the question. Part of the question of the narrative should be is what causes inflation? What is the actual trigger for it? Because if you look at what the U.S. State Department, with 8 families that run Venezuela that are largely European, aka white, and not persons of color, they've decimated that country with food shortages and everything else that caused upwards of 6 million people to leave because the U.S. State Department and the people that run the United States, through our politicians and our bureaucracy, can't stand to have a socialist country do really well. They couldn't stand how many tens of millions of people were literally taken out of extreme poverty and put into a better situation. Did Venezuela make mistakes? Absolutely. Did they overreach and kick a lot of the experts out of the country that ruined their petroleum industry? Absolutely. Were they greedy? Absolutely. But what's the options? We also had the U.S. trying to make sure that not just there's power over resources, but that the U.S. decides whom can use those resources. And the people, and this, I would argue that they're sociopaths and psychopaths that actually run this, are not the people that you're voting for today. As George Carlin says, that's really more of a facade. But what's the real inflation then? What's it now? Who's causing it? If we use the Venezuela model, for example, the food shortages are artificial. The price increases are artificial at the top, but they do cause inflation down below. Most people, especially Republicans and all the experts, will say that it is these gigantic money printing machine that's causing inflation. Might be true, but let's think about it. Maybe it's not. The key thing they're trying to do in history when they have inflation is they're using that as an excuse to stop wage increases, try to put breaks and controls off what people are getting paid. Are there ever any restrictions or pay cuts at the top? Are there anyone that goes like Jamie Dimon from his $36 to $50 million he makes a year? Has he ever been having a pay cut? And of course, the pay is only a slight part of his whole compensation package. Are those ever cut? Are those inflationary? Instead, what we should be looking at is, what's driving all this? What's driving the price increases? There are some inflationary pressures. You do have the H-1B visa program that was supposed to be a temporary measure that gets people from other countries, which is great, to come in and do the things that they can't find local people to do. Vis-a-vis, when I say local, I'm saying people homegrown that grow up in whatever community in the United States. It's supposed to be temporary until we could educate our people. That was 30 plus years ago. Not exactly temporary, is it? Literally multiple generations of people in the US are being shortchanged as usual on an education system, and they're not being tracked into high-paying jobs. And a lot of these high-paying jobs are in fact in the Bay Area, where the housing prices are out of control, where you have restrictions on where to build are out of control from clampdown. You've also got down zoning. Places that could have been built in locations and heights and densities in the early 1960s were downzoned due to concerns about the Great Society. These are, yes, racist decisions because they wanted to keep people of color out of their neighborhoods, so they changed the zoning. That's why you might see tall buildings built in the early 60s. And in those communities, you've never seen anywhere close to the height or density of those buildings in the last 50 years. You do this for every single community, and you can see why the 3 UC Berkeley researchers found that in the 9-county Bay Area of 8 million people, that we are 500,000 housing units short, 500,000, and that was 2018. So what are we now, and how do we change it? Oh, let's go vote. What's that going to change? Most politicians own their homes. Most politicians, if they solved the housing problem over the last many years, these homes wouldn't be going for $1 to $2 million. They'd be going for $300,000 to $500,000 right now, which is what they should be. So we have an artificially inflated home system, which makes a lot of people feel, oh, I feel better. I feel great. The economy is doing well. I can borrow low interest loans off this. Well, that's great, but it's kind of an artificial economy and it only helps some people. And then we have Biden, aka Dementia Joe, the empty vassal that says we're all in this together. We need to support Ukrainians. Switching gears rather rapidly here because Putin is being blamed for the other major price increase. In fact, all of it that was created from the COVID disaster. We'll talk more about that later. But just about everything that was done against COVID statistically could not have been done. They couldn't have made that many mistakes. So it was either incompetent, not likely, or by design. So they've ruined parts of the economy, ruined sectors of the economy as far as the regular mom and pops, but the mega corporations are better now than ever, right? Charging more than ever. Companies like Kroger want to merge, which will decimate personal choices. And you have Putin. Oh, here's a evil Putin causing this price increase. No, he's not. It's the sanctions, which are illegal according to international law. You have the last many administrations come up with this rules-based laws, which is a complete made-up term by the U.S. and the U.S. State Department, to create illegal sanctions that hurt everybody. I call them boomerang sanctions because they're hurting us more than anyone else. Europe, the worst. They're just in a world of hurt. I mean, people are literally going to start dying because they can't have food or energy. So they're screwed on both ends of the spectrum there. So is voting going to change that? Look at the progressives. They wrote this tepid letter to say, hey, maybe Uncle Joe, maybe Dementia Joe, you might consider peace talks. Every war ends with peace talks. No, they'd rather do this $70 billion and more money grift for the defense industry, only a portion of which of money and weapons actually gets to Ukraine. Some goes to the black market. Most of it's just a fire sale to get rid of product that the U.S. defense industry wanted to get rid of so they can make more. Which gets back to James Carville. It's the economy, stupid. How's the economy doing? I view this election more as a referendum on how well the U.S. State Department and CIA propaganda marketing system is doing. Former CIA Director William Casey essentially said, we will know how successful we are when every major aspect of the news is something that we, the CIA, created. And that's largely true. The narrative of Putin, and frankly, even the way he wages the war doesn't make any sense. Why he started the war does make some sense, because for 8 years, ethnic Russians who are Ukrainian citizens were being attacked. Most of the buildings you find that are decimated aren't decimated in the last 8 months. They've been decimated the 8 years prior, where 14,000 died, almost all ethnic Russians, innocent ethnic Russians, by the neo-Nazi psychopaths in Ukraine's government. And the Zelensky puppet, who is a puppet of the U.S. State Department's Victoria Nuland, which is a psychopath in her own category. So it'll be a referendum on that. Most people you have a conversation with don't want to hear any of this. I was asked over the Halloween weekend, who do you think is going to win? And I was essentially trying to say, well, the party in power usually loses, but considering if people really are feeling the hurt and they're appropriating the blame correctly, it's going to be a bloodbath. And it's been apparent there's going to be a bloodbath for about a year now. And even Trump, and the psychopath idiot that he was, didn't escalate to the point of forcing Putin to invade. Now, granted, the lie starts with what the U.S. promised Gorbachev, which was essentially, the quote is something like, in exchange for the wall coming down and the breakup of the Soviet Union, quote, NATO will not move 1 inch east of East Berlin, unquote. And of course, all the right-wing neocons and the neoliberals are saying, oh, no, that didn't happen. Well, of course it happened. And not only did it happen, they doubled it, tripled the size of NATO, essentially. You had 80,000 Ukrainian troops trained to the highest NATO standards. After Turkey, they're the second largest European army, the army of NATO. So they're a de facto NATO country. And then you had Zelensky talking about how I want nukes. We need to use nukes. We had generals, retired generals in the revolving door with the Defense Department contractors. Companies say, oh yeah, nukes are an option. And then, yet they blame Putin as saying Putin's talking about nuclear. Everything is projection. Which goes back a little further to Russiagate. They keep talking about how that was done, but it's been proven for a fact that the download speeds off those laptops of Hillary's could not have been done with the bandwidth that they had technology-wise installed in that area. It had to be pulled off via flash drive or some other connected device. Was that investigated? Did the FBI ever take and investigate those laptops? No. If that's anyone else, do you think the FBI would take a piece of evidence like a laptop and never, ever have it investigated, much less independently investigated? This whole thing is a scam from way back when, because Russiagate, which is the basis of the localized, modernized Russophobia, Russia-hating scapegoating, is because John Podesta knew that Hillary might lose and wanted to blame the Russians and Trump and try to discredit Trump, not realizing the fact that this election today that we supposedly have that's so sacred has never been sacred in the U.S. And lately, look at what they did against Bernie. Not only did they brazenly steal it from him in 16 and 20 in 2016 primaries, they stole it from so many states where they're 8 or 10% off from the exit polls, to 14% in New York, to 33% approximately in Arizona. It was so bad they stopped doing exit polling because people were wise to them. So things that the U.S. State Department and CIA would blame as electioneering and totally stealing elections that the U.S. are experts at are what they're doing here. The food shortages in Venezuela and around the world that they've done, that's what they're doing here. So essentially any problem that you're seeing and you're blaming on Putin or you're blaming on someone else, the U.S. State Department and the people in what they call the deep state have been doing it around the world. They've weaponized it and turned it here. Technology-wise, anything that you do from day to day that affects us day to day, when there's a shit show going on, it's likely being caused by people within our government. I don't know how we change this. People are going to say, oh, you're voting. Did you vote? And then if you don't vote, you're shamed, because a lot of people feel there's no difference. Those people with a gut instinct of it doesn't make a difference, are those the same ones that actually said, oh, wait a second, these flatten the curve in 2 weeks only, or wear a mask, don't wear a mask, or do this, don't do that during COVID? Are they the same types that actually had a gut instinct, an intuition to say, my bullshit detector is going off? Likely. There's got to be some crossover there. So anyone that raises a question or dares to question the narrative on YouTube and all these other companies is censored. Censorship. As I mentioned over the weekend at that same party and to other places, and I've gotten shut down each time, is when has censorship ever really helped us in history? Never. Look at Nazi Germany. There's a lot of parallels there that they did there. Of course, that's Joseph Goebbels, the person that said if you're going to create a lie, there's got to be some truth to it, but the lie needs to be massive. So massive that people would think, our government can't do that. Our government can't do that. Ask African Americans what the U.S. government is capable of doing. Ask Japanese Americans what the U.S. government is capable of doing. Look at the ship of innocent Jewish people during World War II coming to the U.S. to be saved and other countries to be saved. What is the U.S. government capable of doing? How did the U.S. government get Japan into the war? What did the U.S. do to save those in those horrible concentration camps, knowing full well what was happening? What did the U.S. government do? 2 million normal Germans, many of which in the war, were held in camps in atrocious conditions, war crime level conditions. Patton was raising holy hell from it, and part of the reason Patton was assassinated was probably because of that, and he talked about the threat of the Soviet communist threat. If the U.S. is willing to assassinate the most powerful and successful general in our history, and perhaps one of the world history, as well as our president, Camelot, if the U.S. is willing to look the other way while Kissinger ruins peace talks between LBJ and North Vietnam. If the U.S. got us into war with Gulf of Tonkin, if you investigate all the major nuclear industry accidents that are not accidents, if you look at how Israel was able to steal U.S. nuclear weapons between 200 and 400 in the late 60s, what's possible? If the U.S. was able to engage in the 7-Day War and keep that a secret, at the same time being attacked, USS Liberty, Israel attempted to sink a U.S. Navy ship with no repercussions. 9/11, no repercussions. False pretenses go into Iraq and Afghanistan, no repercussions. No one is held accountable on either party, on any administration. The massive amount of war crimes, the massive amount of threats that our forefathers warned us about, enemies, foreign and domestic. Nothing's happened. How are things going to change? You had the 30 members just recently put up that letter that I mentioned to Biden saying, you might want to start talking peace. No repercussions for them pulling back. In fact, everything that has been happening has been focused on what the super hyper rich and the massive corporations want. It used to be a point that 60% of all the taxes were paid by corporations. It's the other way around. 60% are paid by people making under $100,000 a year, family income in this country. You have massive housing shortages, massive housing inflation prices. We have all of the Federal Reserve, that's not a government institution, but highway robbery from the richest bankers in the world. And the Fed has, as of 2015, lost 92%. Now we're over 95% of all the value of the dollar has been evaporated. Might be as high as 98% by now. Are there any repercussions? Is your vote today going to make a difference? If you don't get what you want today and you don't like your side, whatever side you're on, are you going to blame others saying, oh, you shouldn't have voted. Why didn't you vote? I mean, seriously, let's think about this. We need to listen to what Thomas Jefferson and others said when your country is taken over. What do they ask you to do? Said it is actually your right and your obligation as a U.S. citizen to abolish that government. Is this the government that you thought we had even 40 years ago, 50 years ago? Does it make sense that voting is going to make a difference? Put you this way, if you're a ship and you're going off 2 degrees, and in the last 3 months, increased at 3 degrees. 2 months ago, went to 4 degrees off. Last month, it's 5 degrees off every single day. Are some slight minor corrections of half a degree going to get you off course? In the last 6 months, you've gone anywhere from 2 to 5 degrees off course. Just do the math on that. We are so 180 degrees, or whatever the term you want to use, off course from that ship. It's not a matter of tacking to channel the wind. It's a matter of how do you take the country back. Do you think voting's the way to do it? I don't have the answer, but I tell you, voting's not the answer. They've created a system that has basically robbed the country of all of its resources, and they're plundering. Green New Deal is the same way. They're plundering it from the poorest and working class And who's benefiting from it the most? People that have stock or corporations in green companies that are making hand or fist money-wise. When the people that are causing climate change aren't those driving cars. 6 to 20% maybe in the entire transportation section, depending on who you listen to. It's mainly industry and the United States military. U.S. military, if it's considered a country, is the 4th largest polluter in the world as far as climate change. Just our military. That's the same military that has a almost $900 billion budget, but never gets discussed how there's also a operating budget that is never, ever discussed. And in this budget, it's $500 billion. And that doesn't include all of the operational costs. You'll see in Congress, they have add-ons all the time to add on costs. And no, that doesn't include the cost to Ukraine. So once again, you've got all of this stuff happening and they're blaming it on inflation and all these things are happening. So what are we going to do? How do we change this? Once again, I don't have the answer, but I can tell you anything that they're proposing is beyond woefully inadequate. It's not even going to be a scintilla mustard seed, and I'm using that term on purpose, enough to make a change. So, long, very long video while I'm walking my dogs, trying to do this election day video. If you don't like the results, don't get mad at others. If you like the results, don't expect them to have major change. As George Carlin said, it doesn't really matter. And as Vox and others have concluded with their research, most of it doesn't happen anyway. And then when you realize that Vox, like most of the media, is a controlled opposition media and completely bought, sold, and paid for by the corporate government interests out of the CIA and others in the U.S. State Department, you're going to realize, wow, if they're giving that information and that's controlled opposition, what is the real truth when you realize that they claim 92% doesn't matter? It's probably because it's more like 99.99999% really doesn't matter. So that's some long-winded thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are on this if you watched any portion of the video. Want this as a food for thought. Anything, critiques, suggestions of how to fix the situation are great. Once again, I'm just bringing it up just to foster communication. No hate messages needed. No nasty diatribe needed. No talking about how I shouldn't walk my dogs for half an hour while I'm talking. And happy election day. I'm glad we can have an election day. But let's actually start making changes that make material, significant difference. Not just, as George Carlin would say, it's just for show. And it is. And it is important. But we need something a lot more systemic and a lot more deep and impactful to make changes that we have to make that have been taken off course for not just 40 years. We're talking all the way before the founding of the country. But that's for another video. Be well.